Welcome back, everyone. Next, I have the pleasure of introducing Rebecca Copper. She will be presenting her graduate lecture about lens-based practices and socially engaged art. She'll be sharing the work that she's developed during her studies at Portland State University, focusing on site-specific projects created in Colonial Hills and her archive project, the Single Parent Archive, which was founded with Marty Clemens. Please welcome Rebecca Copper.
Thank you for that introduction, Shelby. I appreciate it. Hi, my name is Rebecca Copper, and I'm an artist and soon to be, hopefully, graduate of the Art and Social Practice program at Portland State. And I live in what is now known as Ohio today, which is the ancestral lands of the Shawandasi-Tula, the Kaskaskia, and the Miami people. And I'll be sharing about my artistic practice, and I want to thank you for being here and taking the time to listen. So today I'm going to focus on two main bodies of work that I've developed during my studies at Portland State. A series of site-specific art projects that evolved from my residence in a place called Colonial Hills, and an archival project, the Single Parent Archive, that I co-founded with Marty Clemens, which centers the experiences of single parents. And I'll share information about my background, the context that I'm working from when I engage in my practice, and I'll briefly describe a few of my past projects that led me to where I am now in my work. And more importantly, or I think so anyways, I'll be discussing the ideas behind my work and how my embodied knowledges form my own understandings that I communicate and process through my photographic-based practices, which feed directly into my socially engaged practice. So my experience frames the way I see and how I perceive more than anything else could ever influence me. And in my work, I directly derive content and how I approach art making from my individual experiences. And I'm extremely interested in how people, including myself, how we perceive our realities and how the different forms of media are used to translate or even mediate our perceptions of experience. And when I pull from my experiences, I do it both consciously and unconsciously or subconsciously. My work reflects back to me the things I wasn't fully aware of or that I was doing at the time. And I like to lean into those unconscious parts of my practice because I feel that it helps develop more awareness of myself and the things around me. And this video that I'm showing you right now, I recorded this on an evening walk with my son, Adrian, who is here today, at a park in Columbus, Ohio. But for me, it embodies a specific aesthetic, a kind of evocation that I attempt to encapsulate in my work. And I look for an understanding that isn't possible to garner from a classroom or a book. To quote the artist and philosopher Adrian Piper on concrete particularity, each individual experience is so finite and so unique that no big fat book could ever articulate it. The camera gave me a tool to explore framing and a way to communicate viscerally. I first developed a photography practice when I would take photos with my brother's camera. Sometimes with his permission, other times not. It's not quite clear in my memory, but I vividly do remember one time when it was around spring and very rainy. I wandered through the 12 acres that surrounded our factory manufactured home in rural Ohio, attempting to photograph what it was that I was experiencing both externally and internally. And over the next 15 years or so, I'd further my practice with the camera, which would evolve into a socially engaged practice where I could expand my work conceptually. My photographic studies were primarily based on darkroom processes and film photography, eschewing the instantaneous control and reproducibility of digital cameras. I preferred the darkroom. Film offered a slower way to create a process-oriented visual language. And this allowed me to develop a practice of response rather than dictation. My images resembled the instability and lack of ultimate control that I felt I had in my life as a single parent in my early 20s. The photographs were an output of my experiences as I photographed what was in front of me. And I was drawn to surrealism and automatic manipulation, experimenting with the dark room, as well as with time-based media. Deeply inspired by Dadaism and other avant-garde practices of blurring life and art, naturally I became interested in socially engaged art. When the darkroom grew less accessible for me, in my practice, I began exploring collaborative artworks. My grandmother was a foundational adult in my life who had a major presence. She taught me to draw when I was a child. She had taken one-off drawing classes at a local arts college, Columbus College of Art and Design. And after my son was born, Adrian, we even took painting classes together at the Cultural Arts Center. And near the end of her life, as she was unable to walk, she eventually lost the ability to use her hands. She had sifted in and out of hospice and assisted care centers where she was completely unhappy. My family figured a way to bring her home for hospice care at home, we recognized that it wasn't right to let this person that we loved so much to die in a cold and alien place. So I would visit her on Sundays when I could. And because she was unable to use her hands to do what she loved, to draw, I asked her to tell me how to draw the lines. And together we drew a picture of my mother and my older brother referencing a photograph. In 2015, after the death of my grandmother, I began volunteering for hospice, and I requested engagement from local creatives through letter writing. I acted as a mail delivery person, delivering letters to the people in hospice that I'd visit. And reflecting on this project later, I realized I was actually embodying my mother's longstanding job as a mail clerk at the United States Post Office. And here are two examples from that project. And if you notice, we are using the first initials or the first initial of the first name because of HIPAA, we couldn't actually use the full name. And that's also why I ended up delivering these letters because I couldn't share where they were at or their addresses of the assisted care centers. I produced other collaborative works, such as curating images of people eating food, working with artists inside of a medium security prison, and establishing a photography class at my son's daycare. Pictured here is a photo that Maya took while participating in my photography class at my son's daycare in 2018. Maya was 9 years old and Adrian was 8 at the time. And then fast forward to when COVID happened. I spent the summer of isolation returning to my love of film photography, thanks to my dear friend, Rachel Anderson. Rachel, who is also an artist, introduced me to an accessible film practice through a specific camera that produces beautiful instant painterly images, the Polaroid SX70 Land camera. And a side note, this is the same camera that Andy Warhol liked to use. And I also want to give a shout out to Left-Handed Sophie, who let me know on that, or let me in on that information. And during that time of extreme isolation and uncertainty, where Rachel and I were these kind of like isolation partners, we created a space of care and platonic relationship building at their family's orchard. And we did this through using the camera. While there were art objects created, the photographs, I argue that the process in which Rachel and I deepened our friendship, this development of trust and support of each other through the camera, is the actual art, and that these photographs are just an artifact output, a record of our time together. And this really affected how I approached what I thought was a dualistic practice of creating photographs and creating socially engaged art projects. I realized more concretely that my socially engaged art practice is actually a lens-based practice, that I use the camera and images as a starting point, and then approach my socially engaged artwork conceptually and characteristically as if I'm using a camera. Thinking about photography as a collaborative practice made me consider more deeply the photography practice of Wendy Ewald. And thinking about lens-based practices in this way encouraged me to think more about the camera and its function, how it's used in producing images, historically too, thinking about documentary photography, fine art photography, how photography is used in science, anthropology, to the present day use of social media. I was introduced to the writing of Ariella Aisha Azoulay through Lucy Cotter's class here at the Art and Social Practice program at Portland State. And I was drawn to Azoulay's description of the camera as a tool of imperialism, as she points this both out directly and metaphorically. She points out that the function of the camera is used as a tool of extraction. To better explain, the camera is used to capture and reproduce something that is happening in real time and in real space. And that something is removed from its original environment. It's flattened and replicated as to preserve the event, person, or object because we have a desire to keep it. One might even say we have a desire to own it. Azoulay connects this technology of extraction to the historical context that the camera was created in. She describes the Napoleonic expeditions as a paradigmatic example. The assumption of the Western, quote, right to dissect and study people's worlds, to render their fragments into pieces to be meticulously copied, unquote. Looking at the work of Wendy Ewald and Ariella Azoulay helped me see through lines in my own work and helped me determine how it is that I want to be using a camera. So now I'll be moving into these two main bodies of works that I have created through my studies at PSU, or Portland State University. Colonial Hills is a series of site-specific projects. They are specific to a suburb that exists just north of what is known as Columbus, Ohio. Colonial Hills was plotted in 1927 on the lands that rightfully belong to the Kaskaskia, the Shawandasi Tula, and the Miami people. And the series consists of three major parts, one being the suburb study, which is a photographic series, two being Auditing Ohio, a textbook auditing project, and three, the world of Colonial Hills, which is an attempt at a public conversation. So the suburb study was my first project that evolved out of my temporary residence within Colonial Hills. It is a photography project that I created using a disposable camera. My mom, myself, and my child had just moved into Colonial Hills of Worthington, Ohio. This was in 2017. My mom and I decided to rent this house together. We were both renting small apartments and thought living together could be good for us, and especially for my son, Adrian. Housing instability has been a multi-generational thread for a number of women in my family, specifically the ones who were primary caretakers on their own, single parents, single mothers. My mother experienced this and her mother experienced this, and it was a track that I followed. I had recently wrapped up litigation over parenting rights, and the experience left me feeling extremely vulnerable and sensitive to an imposed pressure of a specific set of idealisms that I didn't construct. The day that I moved into the suburban home, I actually learned that my father was in the hospital. And here it's extremely important for me to mention that my dad battled alcoholism my entire life. But he wasn't the stereotypical belligerent or abusive alcoholic in the ways that films and many other forms of media portray people who are battling alcoholism or substance abuse. My dad was present with my older brother and I. He kept his small South Side home clean and tidy. He cooked us meals when we'd stay with him. He always appeared relaxed and collected, adding small bits of whiskey to his coffee throughout the day to keep him going. My dad spent 16 days in the hospital before he died. He fell into a coma and never came back. His liver had a 3-month prognosis, and he wasn't a candidate for any kind of transplant. Hepatic encephalopathy, a coma induced by the scarring of my dad's liver. And so I used a disposable camera to process my grief of losing my dad. I walked around my new place of residence and photographed the surrealness and loneliness I was experiencing. The neighborhood was haunted by this iconic dream of the 1950s. It really felt like I was on the Truman Show. Cars would pull out by 9 a.m. like clockwork. They would pull out of their driveways and trail each other on their way to work. Mothers and paid caregivers would then stroll down the sidewalks. In the evening, cars would return home and you'd see these nuclear families gathered at their tables in their large bay windows. For me, the suburb was representative of everything that I wasn't able to provide for Adrian, my son. And it's of what it was, blah, 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 excuse me. It is also what I felt shamed for not having or being, even within my own childhood. My projects within Colonial Hills began with the camera. I used the camera to capture and reproduce what it was that I was processing in both my physical world as well as in my internal world. And the events of my life, including the death of my father, colored how I viewed and engaged with the suburb. For me, the images reflect an emptiness, a sense of isolation and loneliness. I chose to use the disposable camera because it was accessible and easy to walk around with, but also because of its time-based nature. The fact that it was designed to exist for one purpose, for a short period of time. It was designed to be thrown away. And with it, it also carried this kind of dreamy, nostalgic quality in the images that were created from my photography series. And for me, that connected directly to my childhood. So the second project in this series is Auditing Ohio, and it's a textbook auditing project that I workshopped with Adrian's class at Colonial Hills Elementary. The project occurred during the fall of 2019 through the spring of 2020, right before the pandemic. So textbooks and photographs have a lot in common. Both the photograph and educational textbooks are different forms of preservation. And textbooks, like the photograph, are composed with a particular framing of reference created by a dominant hand. When I started the Art and Social Practice graduate program, I had left a job at an educational publishing company, McGraw-Hill Education. I worked there for nearly 7 years as a media designer and developed sharp opinions about public education and the materials that were created to teach youth. From being a part of the production of these materials, I really got to see the inside processes and practices. So then when Adrian was entering the 4th grade at Colonial Hills Elementary, during a parent-teacher conference with Adrian's teacher, Kevin Acton, I noticed the social studies textbook that the class was using. And it was actually a textbook that I had worked on as an employee of McGraw-Hill Education. I asked Kevin if I could workshop with Adrian's class an audit of their social studies textbook. And to my surprise, Kevin actually said yes. I made large newsprint copies of the textbook, and we grouped students into groups of 3, and they worked together to audit their social studies textbook. Each student was given a red pen and asked to write their opinions on the newsprint. We tried to give them the freedom to write whatever it is that they wanted. Meanwhile, Kevin and I organized class discussions around perception, representation, and power dynamics. The students critiqued the design, the large number of maps used, the lack of accuracy and representation, and the poor image choices. They also took the opportunity to color in devil horns, mustaches, and write speech bubbles. So this is one of the examples. It might be kind of hard to read what the students wrote, so I'm going to read those for you. So the students wrote, "Why is this important? Only white people? Offensive? Why do you say Christopher Gist, or just, I don't really know how to say that, discovered America, and discovered spelled with a K? It was the Native Americans. Why do we need to know about these guys? I think the timeline is helping us. And here's another student example, and I'll read these notes as well. If you look on the map where it's circled, that says COVID-19 is here. It's only showing fossil fuel, meaning fossil fuel. This doesn't show us all the stuff in Ohio. Are this animals soft? Some kids don't know what a primary source is. And then speaking about the eagle, this is Ohio, not all states. Burning resources causes pollution. Unfortunately, we were only able to work through 1/3 of the book when COVID-19 forced everyone away from public spaces. And I have so much gratitude for the students, my collaborators, who participated in this project. Okbogsy, Ottawa, Edil, Pranish, Shai, Adrian, Griffin, Sylvia, Sharon, Ben, Greta, Chrisabel, Augusta, Will, Colin, Gavin, Faduma, Eva, Evelyn, Jordan, and Jasessia. What this project confirmed for me is how aware children are of their surroundings and what is going on in the world, but also how these educational materials really do play a crucial role in the perceptions and understanding of collective reality and the different histories that exist. And so moving into the last project of this series within Colonial Hills is this project, World of Colonial Hills, Past, Present, and Future, which is a project I did in collaboration with Minus Plato. And Minus Plato is actually an alias created by Richard Fletcher. And Richard Fletcher has a background in Greek mythology and Mediterranean cultures. And so this alias was created, Minus Plato, as a kind of critique of those like romanticizations of these predominant canons. So by 2021, my family had moved away from Colonial Hills, the suburb, and Adrian had moved on to middle school. But I still wanted to know how my old neighbors felt about this word colonial. For me, the contemporary name of the place was intertangled with the complexities of single parenting, economic devaluation of care, isolation, not to mention the violent histories that feed into our realities of today, such as genocide, slave-based labor, Western expansion, our climate crisis, and so on. So I connected with Minus Plato to host a conversation with the residents of Colonial Hills through their radio show, Dear Fellow Settler Colonizer. I asked residents to participate in a dialogue about this word colonial and what it represents to them, or what they think about the colonial histories of the United States. I printed out multicolored flyers and I posted them around the neighborhood, advertising the conversation a few weeks prior to the event, And each flyer had information tabs informing of the date, time, and place of the planned conversation. And then when walking through the neighborhood right before the conversation, I noticed that a large number of information tabs were missing from the flyers. And to me, this indicated an interest in participation in this conversation from my former neighbors. So on the day of the conversation, I set up a tent. It had been raining at a park near the north entrance to the neighborhood, right in front of the Colonial Hills signage. I sat underneath the tent with Minus Plato, Adrian, my partner, and we were waiting for people to show. I brought highlighted texts from Azule's book, Potential History, Unlearning Imperialism, and Minus Plato brought their recorder. And while a good portion of these tabs were missing, showing a particular kind of interest, when the timing of the event came, no one from the neighborhood actually showed up to engage in our conversation. We watched as a woman walked by with her dog with what looked like could have been a glass of wine, no judgment, like I would do that too, but she didn't come to talk to us. And regardless, we recorded a conversation for the show about the name Colonial Hills as we sat under this tent in the rain. This non-engagement from the sleepy suburb reflects my relationship to the place that started with the images that I photographed in 2017. In conversation with artist and educator Michelle Illuminato, it was pointed out to me that mirrored in this attempt for a conversation was the same emptiness that the photographs carried. I created a publication that collects all of these projects in one place that are connected to Colonial Hills. The book contains my photographs of Colonial Hills from 2017, a personal narrative describing in more detail what the process of losing my dad was like, and how I connect his death to the devaluation of care that my grandmother, mother, and I dealt with as single parents. I find Colonial Hills embodies all of these things directly because of my experience in the place, but also emblematically, as Colonial Hills symbolizes to me a way of living or a practice of living that extends outside of its locale, a practice of living or a way of living that is encouraged in the United States. And so now I'll be moving into the second body of work, the Single Parent Archive. The Single Parent Archive is a growing archive that houses collections that centers the multiplicity of experiences connected to single parenting. The archive was co-founded in 2021 by archivist Marty Clemens and myself, of whom both have backgrounds as single parents. The goal of the archive is to preserve and reclaim self-identification as a single parent, to provide a space to share the complex experiences of being a single parent. At 19, I learned I was pregnant during the finals of my first semester at my second attempt at college. My mother, a single parent, worked nights most of my childhood and still works second shift today. My mother's mother, who was also a single mother, had 4 children in the late 1940s through the 1960s and cared for them alone, up until she met my grandfather, who she left later in the 90s. My mother's mother, my grandmother, she worked up until a few years before she passed. My interest of starting an archive dedicated to single parents began with my own accumulation of images that I took of my child as we grew up together over the past decade or so. Again, I started my practice with using a camera and my personal story as a point of reference. Extending outward, I wanted to meet others at the intersections of single parenting, to highlight the vast experiences, but also to have my own translation and mediation of what it means to be a single parent. Through my personal experience as a young single mom, I developed tender awareness of the treatment and negative connotations that are often associated with single parents. That unfortunately is also reinforced by the institutions that single parents have to rely on. Seeing my own images grouped together made me think about the ultimately creative, intuition-based improvising that I had to do that allowed me to provide for myself and my child from the age of 19 onward. And that every single parent solely providing for a dependent has to have these kinds of creative skills. For me, the archive is about not only collecting stories for preservation, but also about framing these parents as creatively cognizant. Early research for this archive began with a collection of tapes that are actually already housed in the Portland State University archives in special collections, where my collaborator, Marty, works. Marty came across a box of audio tapes with a group of materials submitted to the Portland State University archives from the feminist bookstore, in other words. Recorded on these tapes are firsthand accounts of lesbian and queer parents going through custody battles in the late 1970s and early 1980s after they came out. But little information accompanied these tapes, and there were no signed release forms. So as it stands now, these audio tapes are not open to the public. I haven't even listened to them. But knowing my experience dealing with custody and court systems, I felt connected to them. So Marty and I have been working together to track down what names we can find associated with these tapes. And we are recording our own conversations with the people that we can get in contact with. So far, we've spoken with Gila Tenenbaum and Catherine English, who are queer lawyers assisting the community in different ways. Catherine was the first lawyer to win a custody case for a lesbian mother in Multnomah County, and created an education project to help educate judges on queer parenting. Gila helped gay couples with legal documentation such as wills and live-in agreements to help ensure their rights both as individuals and as a couple. We also spoke to Pat Young and Cindy Comfort. Pat Young taught a capstone at Portland State University about LGBTQ history and was a freelance writer for the magazine Just Out. Cindy Comfort was the first lawyer to win a gay adoption in the United States. And I'm going to share just a little bit of audio from some of our recordings. And this is Catherine speaking.
In 1979, maybe it was even 1978, when I first began to work on lesbian custody cases, there were no victories. The thing that we sought at that time was visitation and sometimes even contact. And the fights were fairly
with arguments being that lesbians would raise lesbian children, would raise queer men, would influence these children badly. And so contact, often we settled for supervised contact. And it was very tragic how many queer parents lost custody, lost contact, lost visitation rights.
I hope you were able to hear that. We had some speaker issues, but I hope you heard it. The conversations are ongoing and are being recorded, like I said. The first two conversations were published in the Social Forms of Art Journal, also known as the SOFA Journal, put out by the Art and Social Practice Program, with a third conversation that was just released today at the SOFA release launch party this morning. And so through recording the search for who is on the audio tapes, Marty and I are hearing first-person accounts of rich histories of queerness and single parenting and where they converge. And in this convergence, the stories are both tragic and inspiring. And before I move on to some of the archive submissions, I do want to share another sound bit that shares some of the joy that was actually found in between the very difficult aspects in the fight for queer parents, or queer parenting rights. Yeah.
Thanks a
I
lot.
remember somebody moving from
This is Gila
somewhere
and Catherine
else in
talking.
Oregon to Multnomah County so that they could get in front of one of these judges.
That's right. These were two women from Tillamook who had worked in the fish factory there. And they came to me for consultation. And I told them if they filed in Tillamook County, they didn't have a chance in hell. And they should move to Multnomah County and wait to file for the divorce. So they did that. They moved to Multnomah County and resided here for 6 months so they could file in Multnomah County. And we did a lot of that kind of underground work in order to prepare clients before they filed for divorce. And those two particular women were both motorcyclists. This is a fun story. They both were rabid motorcyclists. And so when we got set for trial, I told them, now listen, dress up, okay? You want to look really, really nice. So dress up. So we were all sitting there in the courtroom, the courthouse lobby, waiting for the trial to begin. And up stride my clients up the stairs in their finest leathers. Oh my God, they had jackets and pants and a hat, and they just looked super grand and super butch.
Fun fact, they did win that case if you were curious, even with their leathers. Currently, the Single Parent Archive has acquired photographs, experimental narratives, poetry, interviews, recipes, and a comic, all related to the experience of single parenting. For example, Amy Schuelsler submitted a quasi-fictional narrative that blurs her personal experience with a muse created, and this muse she developed through, I guess, was inspired by this statue. So this muse holds on to an anchor that Amy connects to her desire for the ability to breathe underwater when feeling like she was drowning. Paired with the writing are found photographs of domestic spaces collapsed in floods and her own black and white images of the ocean. Peter Freeman, who became a single dad later in life, learned how to cook for his daughters through his wife's recipes after she passed. Peter's daughters then interviewed him about their experiences together. The recipes were scanned and then also accompanied by Peter's reflections about them. The archive is in the process of building a digital platform or a website that showcases these collections, making them accessible to a wider public. All items entered into the archive are made into digital copies so that the actual items, the objects, stay with their original owner, who maintains the autonomy over the art object, or not the art object, the object or text. All digitized content is professionally housed and kept within the Portland State University Special Collections, specifically within the Art and Social Practice Archive. The first submissions were turned into a clamshell box publication celebrating the inaugural collection. And there is a hope to produce a collection-based publication annually to physically produce these materials, marking them as art objects. And here's my plug. If you are a child of a single parent or have history as a single parent and are interested in sharing your story, you can reach out to us through our email, singleparentarchive@gmail.com, or check us out online through our social media, our Instagram, at Social Parent Archive. That's not right. Single Parent Archive. Thank you. I'm glad you guys have humor. And our website, singleparentarchive.org. And so with that, I'm going to wrap up my presentation. My work comes from a place that is of specific interest to me, where my personal histories intersect with experience, and they are the starting point for my research. I begin directly by making images and then replicating this lens-based practice metaphorically and symbolically in my socially engaged artworks. Looking at processes of preservation, such as images, books, archives, and the content that is chosen to be preserved. And I'm considering my own role in mediation, the mediations of our realities and histories. With the Single Parent Archive, I'm working with Marty Clemens, where we frame a specific perspective through being a single parent. And thanks to my studies at Portland State University, I was able to find a resolve in my practice through both the camera and social engagement. I'm now able to understand my practice, as well as this attraction to my brother's camera from my youth, and how that feeds directly into how I approach my socially engaged art. And with that, I want to thank you again for listening to me speak about what it is that I do, and I can take questions if there are any.
Yeah, I have a question. The question that's coming to me at this point, Rebecca, is that both, oh, want me to be, just so you can get to the mic, Zoom mic.
But beware, there is a cord. I will not trip on it because I already did that several times. Hi, should I be right here? Okay. Hi, congratulations.
Thank you.
The question that came to my mind right now, both the way you started the talk and the way you ended the talk was really talking about how your work comes from your very specific personal interests, your specific personal perspective. And in terms of working as a socially engaged artist, what are your strategies and techniques for getting other people to engage with your specific interests?
Oh, that's a really good question.
I'm gonna get off the screen here.
How do I bring people to what I'm interested in? I mean, I think I just asked them. I mean, thinking about Adrian's class and the textbook auditing project, I literally just saw the book and was like, hey, Kevin, here's my interest. Will you do it with me? Am I allowed to do it with your class? And Kevin was like, yeah, sure. And same with Marty. When I wanted to start the single parent archive, I just reached out to Marty and I said, hey, we both experienced this differently, but we both experience it. Maybe we can do this together. And that's also how I've engaged with other single parents that I've connected with. They're people that I know that I've just kind of been like, hey, I'm doing this. Do you have any interest? I'm actually excited because if you were here earlier, Benita, who worked with Shelby Loomis, there's Shelby, might also work with me on the single parent archive. And it was mostly because Shelby was like, hey, Benita's a single parent. So yeah, that's how I've been kind of pulling people. It's very informal.
Thanks.
There is a question online. Michelle, do you want to unmute?
Yes. Great job.
Oh, hold on.
Love that. Can you hear me?
Okay, now try.
Okay, great job. I really loved hearing how you laid it out today. One of the things that I'm curious about is just thinking forward about where do some of the projects go. Of course, you talked about the single parent archive, but I'm thinking about some of your other work, and I'm curious about what are some of the things when you don't have this framework of class and what's been going on for the last 3 years. What do you think that you'll kind of reach into? I mean, will there be kind of a different projects that you have in mind right now, or are there things like the project with the books that I really admire? Are there second parts to some of those things? So I'm just thinking about what you'll do next month.
Of course. I appreciate that question, Michelle. I'm obviously going to be continuing the work of the single parent archive and working through those conversations about the tapes. Catherine English has given us a bunch of names, as well as Gila and Pat Young and Cindy Comfort. And so Ruth Gundel is someone that I'm going to be trying to get in contact with next. So that's where a lot of my time will be focused, I think. I am also thinking about returning to projects that I haven't been able to flesh out. So one is a walking project that is also using the camera. But instead of me starting with the camera, I'm asking people to kind of chart out or map out a walk, where then I will follow that walk that they mapped out with my camera, trying to embody what it was that they're experiencing. But obviously it's like the telephone game. It's going to be biased and it'll be through my perception. And another project that I'm thinking about is the Slow Responders Club. I'm interested in thinking about slower ways to move through life and encouraging other people to do that. So if you want to join the Slow Responders Club, you can email me at RebeccaLCopper@gmail.com.
I have a question.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle.
Shall we go to the mic? I will be there at the mic.
Hi, Rebecca. My question for you is, I feel as I reflect, as you are presenting about the projects, that there is kind of like an overarching theme of you encouraging participants to look. I'm thinking about the lens-based practices. I'm thinking about auditing Ohio and the single parent archive. What do you hope that your participants take away when they work with you? What is something that they learn about themselves or about the project? And what is your hope that they take away with them?
Yeah, that's also a really good question. Yeah, so I feel like when I do and specifically the projects that I shared when I was starting, where I start from my experience, I'm kind of like, this is a thing that I'm trying to figure out. And so I ask people to kind of meet me at that experience. But then at the same time, I try to leave it open for them to kind of formulate their own opinions and their own ideas about what it is. So obviously I'm like, this is a thing that I experienced and I have my own views of it. But I also want people to develop their own perceptions. So in terms of what they take away from it, I mean, maybe it's just them understanding that this is where I'm coming from. And maybe it's okay that they take something else away from it. Yes, Emma.
My question, my question is that I see a big through line of archiving work in your process. And I know personally that you have once worked for the Portland State Art and Social Practice Archive.
Yeah.
And I just see that through line within all of the work that you presented.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, like, what is it about archiving that is important to you, and why do you do that sort of work?
Oh yeah, I appreciate that. Thanks, Emma. So yeah, I actually started working at the Art and Social Practice Archive my first year under Lo Moran, and that's how I connected with Marty Clemens. And for me, I think archiving is a really powerful tool, even though I critique it myself after reading Azile's writing. But I think it's like the particular way that archives function historically, where they kind of take things and then they preserve it and they keep it away from the community. So in thinking about doing the the single parent archive, I'm trying to leave that autonomy of whatever's being put into the archive and leaving it with whoever is submitting that, so that it's not like all of the power of the object or whatever's being submitted is then given to an institution. I want that to be about more with the people or the community. So I'm interested in how the archives can be more accessible and maybe have a different way of preservation. And yeah, it's kind of like thinking about images and textbooks too, right? An archive can create a historical story that people can use for reference. So depending on what that archive contains and how it contains it, I think can really impact how we perceive the world around us. Lisa?
If I ruin this cord, this is all of our tech right here. It's this cord. Hi, what a beautiful presentation.
Thank you.
I want to go back to the beginning when you were talking to us about this moment that happened during the pandemic. I think you were working with the Polaroids and with Rachel.
Yeah.
And you talked about this being a time that really opened your eyes to how photography and socially engaged modes of working came together. Can you tell us a little bit more about what that meant?
Yeah. So for me, and I kind of mentioned this in my presentation just slightly, but for me, using the camera is also a way to develop a relationship. And even through assembly and last night helping Mo, I don't know who's here now, but helping Mo like work with the camera, like I'm learning that that's another way that I can develop a relationship. So what I was trying to say with that is that Rachel and I were both using these cameras, and they were tools and they were kind of things that we could play with out in the world, but we were taking photographs together and sharing these images and talking about the things that were happening around us at that time. So it was more of like a tool or a way to function, I guess, or I don't know. Yeah. Does this make sense? It was a way for us to kind of develop our relationship, but we were using the tool of the camera. to develop that relationship.
And so you went from there to conceptually.
Yeah, conceptually, yes. And
How did that happen? Do you see what I'm trying to, can you all hear me on Zoom? Michelle, can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm curious now that you have this relationship building moment with Rachel, how does this shift your thinking around social practice?
right.
And where does that take your projects? That's from.
So I'm noticing that, and I kind of mentioned this too, so when I engage with the social components of my practice, I'm noticing that I'm like directing an eye towards something that I'm interested in. And so then there's that relationship building that I find that mirrors what I was doing with Rachel. And so then I have an output, which is like either a book or a conversation that's recorded, which kind of mirrors what those photographs were for me.
Any other questions?
Are there any other questions?
Thank you so much, Rebecca. And thank you for everyone for joining us today. We're going to take a short lunch break and return at 2 p.m. for Mo Geiger's graduate lecture about collective doing. We'll see you then.